Hey everyone, it is Teimojin from season 9 of Alone, and today we're talking about episode 3. So we're going to focus on shelter because it's such a great episode for shelter building and all the ingenuities people developed while out there. In addition to that, there will be little tidbits of medical knowledge here and there. So again, if anything sparks your interest, if you want to go in more details of that, let me know in the comments and let's get to it. Welcome to the Survival Doctors channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dr. Tan, and my shtick is I'm an active medical doctor working out here in Owen Sound, Ontario, and I have military training and specialization in Arctic warfare and survival. And I try to give people a little tidbits on the medical side of survival. And throughout this series is super exciting because on the Alone Challenge, for the first time ever, we have a physician undergoing long-term survival. So really interested in sharing some of that stuff with you. And in addition to that, looking at perspectives and strategies and tactics from all these amazing experts in this industry. So if you have found value in this type of content or want to learn more about it, please consider subscribing and click the notification button. I'm trying to pump out at least 2 videos a week, both medical videos and then strategy videos and then Q&As with the cast of season 9 and like always, recaps with these more in-depth discussions. So let's jump in and talk about Jessie's shelter. So a lot of things that I love about her approach. Jessie wants to use the environment as much as she can, and it looks like she wants to take advantage of the earth as much as possible. Great insulation from the earth itself. She tries to dig in the side of the mountain. Caveat is roots in our location. So when you're digging with just a stick and not a sharp shovel, it is a lot of work. Even removing some of the moss is a decent amount of work as well. And we see Jessie move some serious lumber around, about 50 to 60 pound bundles that it looks like. In addition to that, looks like she's doing like a modified structure where it's not really an A-frame or anything that we've typically seen in a textbook, but really cool design. One thing that I've heard a lot of comments about is how big it is. Now we see the skeleton put up. Now I'm not sure if the living quarters or the storage quarters is the same. I'm interested to see what her end plan build is like and how thick the insulation is. Because yes, it's huge and it is tall, but I don't know what her raised bed situation is going to be like in there. I don't know what she's going to use for insulation. If the insulation is going to be very thick, like 2 feet thick, which was similar to my moss kind of structure, we don't know yet. So I'm holding out to get my final say on that, but it is a lot of work that she's putting into this. I'm not sure if she has a saw or what she's using to hack. I know she has a machete, but that is a lot of lumber. One thing to keep in mind, your resources on elevation. So one thing that can save you a lot of energy is if you collect wood from higher up of your shelter and just kind of toss it down. That way you're not necessarily carrying anything and risking the back injury, shoulder injuries, or twisting an ankle. You're basically pushing things downhill. So if you knock it right and just fell trees down, it can go downhill and you can just really push it down to where it needs to be. So when you're looking at shelter locations, not only are you looking for that areas where you can incorporate the land, the side of the mountain, but also the resources on top of it. So you're not climbing and bringing things either at level or even worse, if you're bringing things from bottom up, that's a lot of work. And just to give you an idea, something that's about thigh thick or even bicep thick to cut with just an axe or a saw, that expends a decent amount of calories. And at this time, we're within like the 2 to 3 week day mark. And if you're not getting a lot of food, you can get winded, you can get pretty tired after cutting just like 2 of these. So lots and lots of work. Another tip is if you see something that doesn't have any leaves on it anymore, a dead freestanding, depending on the size of it, you can also rock the tree back and forth. So that's something that I did out there as well. That's one of the main reasons why I did that, is to conserve energy, and also I didn't bring a saw. So to cut things this size was a decent task for me, but what I did is I selected the wood, made sure that it was dead freestanding, and then not only was it good for firewood, but it's also good for building material, and I kind of rocked the tree back and forth. It will snap. The only kind of safety caveat is you have to be very cautious of that snap and make sure that you're not positioning yourself immediately downhill, because that's where that tree will likely fall. So you want to do your best to avoid the trajectory of that. That's one way to take down decently sized and tall dead freestanding trees without using an axe or saw. Another tip that I talked about in my last recap, so check that out on episode 2 on how to split and section off these massive and long pieces of wood without an axe or any tools, because the majority of the wood processing I did out there was with my bare hands. Another thing to comment is the height of shelters. So Jessie's shelter looks like it's taller than her height. I'm not sure if she's going to do rafters inside, a smoke smokehouse or whatnot, but a lot of that heat from your fireplace on the inside, that's where it typically traps. So ideally, a shorter shelter would be a little nice, something that is just tall enough for you to comfortably live in. So with that lower roof, with the bare minimum height of your standing, or maybe crouch down a little bit, you can have a raised bed there and then take advantage of that smaller enclosed structure, because heat dissipates really fast, and the only way to heat something that big is to have a massive fireplace in there and a lot of insulation. To collect all that in addition to these large pieces of wood, that's going to take a lot of work, but you know Jessie, she's going to put in the work and she's going to be pretty strong out there. So let's see how she does. Another cool thing that we see out there is Jessie doing some squirrel pulls or squirrel snares out there. So some of the snares I saw were about like this big, some were a little bigger. The cool thing about snaring squirrels is it's one of the only passive means of getting game out there. Winia mentions this as well in her trapping course that she took before Alone. A lot of squirrel pulls are actual like low diameter pulls, so that gives the squirrel just one way to kind of go down and go through that obstacle course. And it's a personal choice whether you want to do ground snares or like Jessie on fallen trees. I think the fact that she chose a lot of trees that were at an angle really helped encourage animals go down. And you see her talk about the paths that the squirrel might take down these little tree routes and putting snares accordingly. And we see her catch things. That's amazing. One thing that I wish I did more of out there were squirrel pulls with those smaller diameter poles lashed onto trees. So if it's about arm distance apart or a little longer, you can lash it just above head height level. And the best thing to do is to do it at kind of an inclination. Not too crazy, not more than 45, but definitely around the 20 to 30 degrees. That encourages squirrels to run down and run up these things. And the cool thing about these small diameter ones is there's one path to go down, and once they get snared, they get strangulated or caught, fall down on the side of the squirrel pole, and the rest of the snares and that path is open for the next one. And at the end of the day, you can bring that whole squirrel pole with several squirrels on it back to process. So that's one tip that I wish I did more of out there, and I think would be a top tip if you were in a survival situation and squirrels were in your area. Find out where they're nesting, find out where they're trafficking, find out where they're hiding their food stashes, and look where they're running around, and place strategically those squirrel poles. And these are kind of mobile devices that you can move to different locations. So I think that would have been really good use of time and resources. And then we see Jessie kind of enjoying her meal on the beach. One thing to kind of note is kind of at the dawn and dusk times, some predators can be a little more nocturnal and active at those times. So being very cautious about having your emergency safety kind of bear spray or bear bangers or anything like that when you're in that situation, and being very mindful, like Tom was last episode, on wind direction and kind of anticipating where that black bear or whatever wolves will be coming from, because you don't want to get caught off guard in that victory moment when you're eating. Next we have my boy Igor, and he is sustaining himself on bladderwrack kind of seaweed. Imagine that's super tasty, but he might be getting a little tired about eating all this all the time, and I'm sure he's harvesting other berries and stuff like that that just isn't shown on TV. In episode 1 we talk about that 3-day hike that he did for scouting materials, and unfortunately he doesn't have the best site, especially for building a shelter. It looks like it's either really rocky, your options for building is some rock house, and I don't know how desolate it is in regards to wood materials and moss materials, so it might be the case where it's just rocks and very minimal trees, or down where the moss is and it kind of looks a little swampy. Good ideas with Igor building that floor elevation. Again, looking at episode 1, I did talk about something called basal metabolic rate, and your basal metabolic rate in a survival situation, which is typically a lot higher. So if you can remember what that equation is to anticipate how many calories you need to sustain your weight and to perform optimally, let me know in the comments. Or if you want to guess in kilocalories or big C calories, let me know in the comments right now, how much do you think you need to sustain your body mass in a survival situation just like Igor did? Because it's good to know, it's good to estimate for your emergency 48-hour to 5-day ration pack when you're packing for these types of adventures. It looks like in this episode we see Igor pretty dead set on finishing his log cabin. Now it is a solid bomb-proof shelter, but it takes time, it takes resources, and it takes a lot of energy. Just thinking about how heavy things are and the insulation rating of some of these logs, it's a little questionable if it's the best use of your energy out there. We have seen some really nice log cabin and log cabin-esque shelters in the past. A lot of the successful ones that we've seen to completion, the diameters of logs that they have used are typically about this big and not bigger than your thigh for good reason, because it's a labor-intensive process, both with debarking, making little indentations to seat each piece of wood, and if they're not exactly straight, there can be a decent amount of cold gaps. And when we're thinking about, okay, the biggest size I would reasonably make out there or take out there is about half a thigh thick. So that means your wall or your maximum insulation is about half a thigh thick. Ideally, especially in cold Arctic environments, you want something at least a foot, foot and a half, even 2 feet thick to really be a good insulator. And having logs that have just like this thick with a little bit of chinking with moss may not be the best insulation value, despite being one of the highest calorie burner out there. And for someone with a very high basal metabolic rate and a 3-day investment in scouting with very minimal type of food resources so far, I know it's going to be a painful labor of love. But as he's building this at the end of the night, Igor sees a grouse in a tree and whips out his long silky saw and just whacks at it. And I've never seen that before on the show. And grouse aren't the smartest things, but they can see something coming. And the fact that Igor swatted it out of a tree was pretty impressive. I'm so glad he got that first kill and some meat in him, some nutrition. And I hope he ate the whole thing in one shot because he really needs that. One idea that you can do to make a raised bedding situation or a raised cot is to use existing trees. So instead of building a structure, whether that's a little tripod and then putting a structure, or building like a mini log cabin style and making a raised bed, if you have existing trees inside your shelter, which is something that I did, you can cut off the top and then just use that as a platform to latch things on. For me, I used a 3-point system. So I had big trees uphill and then 2 smaller trees downhill, and then 1 A-frame that was part of the structure of the wall itself. And I used that to make right angle triangle. That was my bed, and that was enough to sleep myself, and I was about 3 feet off the ground. So sometimes using existing trees as your lashing points for raised bedding inside a shelter can be a good option and reduces kind of the space that is taken up by making, let's say, a raised bed in a log cabin style, or using that tripod, because that tripod does take up space inside there to make that raised bed. All right, so Adam right now is the person to look out for. He has the shelter that I'm most impressed by, and today is a very special day because he makes some awesome additions. His last episode, we saw him build up wood and moss cabin about a foot thick. Now the shelter is so enclosed with clear windows, which is awesome, that he's having a decent amount of smoke inside his shelter. Now, it is super common for people to have asthma, and if they've had a smoking history, even though they've quit, their lungs can be a little more sensitive to smoke and cause breathing exacerbations, whether that's wheezing or just inability to get in a whole lot of oxygen, coughing fits. And smoke does irritate your eyes, as everyone knows, but in a long-term situation, it can really lead to a lot of sight deficits, which can be really scary. So Adam decides to make a Cobb stove and a chimney. So Cobb, typically made out of clay, sand, and some kind of matrix like grass, dry grass to mix in. And that kind of pulls everything together so that when things dry, they're less likely to crack and less likely to respond poorly when things get damp and kind of expand and contract. So really cool to see him make that mix. It looks like he uses a part of his clear tarp as a base to make the clay and the grass. I don't think he had a whole lot of sand on his area, so it'll be interesting to see how the Cobb holds up. In addition to that, one thing that is ingenious guys. So if you are making a stove, likely the case, you need to do this because it saves a lot of clay. He makes a frame for the stove. What I have seen previously in sub-Saharan Africa is people making frames out of like lining things out of brick first and then plopping clay on top of that. But making that frame out of green wood, really easy to move around and provides a little bit of stability, so you can pack in that clay pretty thinly and still have it hold up, instead of including lobs and monster amounts of clay, which saves you a lot of time, because just an amount like this can be about 5 to 10 pounds, and I'm not sure how far he's hauling it from the river, but that can be a tedious process. So that approach, energy saver, and it turns out that it looks really well done. And for the chimney, he uses that same same concept, frame with the green wood, cob around that, and then he just builds it up. One thing that I would kind of stress is that the longer your chimney is, the more likely it is to aerate really, really well, because it causes a suction type of mechanism. So as heat rises through that chimney, it sucks in that smoke out, and that's how that works. For roof safety, since a lot of what we're using for roofing is either moss or spruce, with the heat around that chimney, even though it's protected by the clay, it can dry out really fast. So just a little bit of sparks can light that thing on fire. So one kind of rule of thumb for chimneys is to have it at least 2 feet above where your roof lies. Not only does that help with that suction tunnel, but it also helps with fire safety. I think next time I'm in a clay-rich environment, one thing that I would want to do is to combine the concepts we see with Juan Pablo and Adam and build a rocket stove. So you have an aeration chamber, which you can very easily mold out with Adam's clay matrix design, and then also a fuel kind of inlet. So you have your oxygen on the bottom, your fuel on the top, and then that big old chimney, which is doable because it's just one more kind of layer, which you might put like either rocks for that middle layer, and that would make an efficient stove. And last thing about Adam's chimney that I really, really like is it has a weather flap. So with clay, especially in a chimney as long as that is, it's pretty hard to dry it out completely unless you fire it out internally. So you can shove a little bit of dry sticks along the chimney as you're going up and light that on fire as it's going. But again, this is inside his shelter, so that is a decent fire hazard. So to protect it from the weather, he does put a piece of the tarp on the top of the chimney with a little bit of space so smoke can come out and rain doesn't go in, which is a great idea. Then we also see Adam fly fishing again. So one of the things that I talked about in previous videos is choosing your rod material for that. And since we're only fly fishing, some people do tenkara, some people make a fly fishing reel. Really, you want something that's pretty long, pretty straight, and has a good flexibility to it. The more flexible it is, not only does it have a nice whipping action, but it's more sensitive, so you can feel the fish biting, because sometimes they'll strike a little bit, but not take it fully. So I was talking to Adam, and he was mentioning that at some points he was taking alder kind of greenwood, kind of like little switches, so that he could really feel the strikes. And Adam had a lot of success with fishing that was not documented on TV. So I imagine that extra sensitivity allowed him to set the hook. So as soon as he felt the bite, he whipped it up and then had that hook caught in the fish's mouth. And just to quiz you from last episodes, how can you tell what fish are eating based on how they're striking? Whether you see bubbles, whether you see little dorsal fins or whatnot, because we see Adam make different types of flies, which is ingenious. He takes a little bit of the sole of his boot, which is bright orange, to make a little bit of an ant fly to mimic something that's floating on top. And that floating material, he can potentially make mouse flies. So as things get colder, fish want to maximize their nutritional intake just like we do. So if they see something that looks like a distressed mouse, that's a big calorie red meat resource for them. So that can be something that can be a floater fly when he mixes in some things that he may get from squirrels and other feathers and different things to make these bigger flies. So I'm excited to see what he does, and excited to see him using his multi-tool as a vise to do this fine work, because a lot of these fly fishing hooks are so tiny compared to your regular fishing off the boat hooks and lake hook. But like a lot of people out there, around week 2, we saw fish kind of dry out, and his strategy for fishing and hunting and just subsisting off the land changed to more of an active hunt. And like everyone else, I'm sure, as you're hunting, you are looking for things that are edible. It looks like he finds a bolete mushroom, which looks a little bit old, but edible, right? And may not have a whole lot of calories, but it does add some flavor, it does add some nutrients inside your meal. Now, the thing about mushrooms is if you're not good at identifying it, especially in a land that you're not familiar with, it can be dangerous. It's that there are more toxic mushrooms than there are other things like, let's say, lichen. So I was a little hesitant to take mushrooms just because I didn't know a whole lot about them. But Adam, going into the game, he did know his mushrooms quite well, and I was very impressed with that and jealous that he got that extra resource out there. And it looks like he had a pouch that he used from his mukluk insert that he was carrying on his side, and we see him collect a ton of berries. And I think he actually got some cranberries as well. And we see him take down a grouse, stuff it with cranberry, and roast it in his Dutch oven, which at that time would have been such a big morale boost to have that really nice crispy skin and deliciousness. One thing that he might be wasting a little bit, grouse is a pretty lean animal, and all the fats on the skin could have been dripping down and burning, which we see in the pan a little bit. But again, for morale, for taste, and for celebration, I see how that choice can be super tempting. tempting. Next we have Benji, and it looks like he transitioned his tarp shelter to a little more permanent shelter. Like I said, using the environment is super helpful. Instead of building up a structure, using things that already exist in a location that is favorable with resources around. Super good idea. He built what looks like a little bit of an A-frame type of shelter using existing trees and just lashing things on there. It is quite high again, but it may be a comfort thing, a preference thing. And then we kind of see him making the skeleton of this. What he uses for insulation for the walls, I'll be really interested to see what he does. One thing that he does mention is he loves being a ground sleeper, and typically even in Arctic type of weather, you want at least 4 inches of insulation. But at the same time, at that kind of lower level, even though you're insulated from the ground, you're still sleeping in a cold gap if you have a fire in your shelter. So that 4 inches of recommended insulation isn't typically enough. You still feel like the frost on your face at that level. Ideally, you would be raised up a little bit more. So we'll see what happens when the environment gets a little colder for Benji. Now, you can mimic what the ground feels like in the insulation since you're already there in a raised bed, because you're still going to be sleeping on boughs or moss or whatever you use for insulation. And I think Benji is one of the ones who had a lot of early success with food gathering. So we see him get a ton of fish and using fish caches. So really cool that we see him pile up a little bit of rocks and then have that stored fish underwater. We'll see if any kind of scavengers find that out, as we have in the past, but having that near that big boulder and having some rocks around it may do the trick. Or maybe it'll attract a big old bear and he'll get a shot at that too. This episode shows Benji's excellent hunting skills, as well as we see him take a shot at a beaver, and the first reaction to beavers is to dive, and we see a lot of thrashing going on. It looks like there is a possible fatal shot, and it looks like he tried to track it to make sure that it didn't go out to the big river, but it's really hard to see how a beaver is moving underwater because it's so torpedo shaped, and with that strong flipper, it can really swim far without being noticed from any surface disturbance. And its first reaction will probably to go back to its home and to go somewhere deep where it can hide. But taking advantage of beaver's instinct to dive deep could allow people to make snares out there. So drowning snares are pretty effective for beavers. Now, a drowning snare set up in a primitive setting would be a little more difficult, just because a stake needs to be driven into the ground and some kind of locking mechanism where the beaver is allowed to go down the pole that's into the ground, but that snare isn't allowed to come back up. So that mechanism typically is a metal one available commercially that locks into place as it's going down, and it prevents the beaver from coming back up for air. But just looking at all the tracks that Benji is seeing on the ground and looking for those transitions between water and soil might be a good place to place some snares that goes around the neck. And it is about nighttime when he decides to finish the tracking the next day, but he did go down to that big river to make sure the beaver didn't go down there, and fingers crossed he finds it tomorrow, because it is such an amazing resource. So much fat in beavers and so much meat as well. And for a brief moment we see Juan Pablo, who finds bear tracks, who's pretty excited about it. He decides to make an alarm system with the cans, the extra cans that he has, which is a great idea, and using those cans as also storage containers for his grouse that he got on day 4, which is super exciting. Now, one thing that is taken for granted out there is how many containers you have. You have that one pot, you have some socks, you have some t-shirts. What else can you use for containers? We've seen previous contestants use boxers, which are XXXL. So I had a 6XL boxer shorts that I used as my berry bag that carried about 7 pounds of berries at a time. So I was able to use that. We've seen people use t-shirts, and spare kind of long sleeve shirt is a possibility as well. But again, when you're using it for foraging, one kind of caveat is that if you're using it and storing it in there, there is a potential to get mold and stuff like that, because it is a pretty damp environment, and that can hinder how your shirt performs later on and the bacteria in it as well, but not a huge deal. Got a lot of comments about people wanting to make clay pots out there, which is awesome. If you have a lot of resources and time and food in your belly and you're just around the fire, I think that's a perfect time to do that. Ideally, your pots need to be refined clay, because any little pebble or twig in it can crack your pot quite easily. One thing that you can use for primitive collection devices that are using natural materials is one thing that I really like that I learned from Jordan Jonas from season 6. So one thing that I learned from Jordan Jonas from season 6 in regards to making very quick improvised pots is that instead of making the whole clay pot with the bottom and everything like that, you can just make the walls on a flat rock. I thought that was very ingenious, and we see him boiling some mushrooms and some stinging nettles for his kid. And in addition to that, we see him not not even fire this thing. So this is kind of wet clay, and he's just putting that directly above a fire to boil the water. One thing to caution is to try to find these flatter rocks in some place that's dry. So you don't want wet rocks, because that means water has kind of seeped through the rocks, and once it's heated up, that can send shards going really fast, and that can go into your eyes, can cause puncture wounds, and would get you pulled for any eye injury out there. A second idea is using birch bark. Now, one of the resources we had out there was birch bark, but it was incredibly rare. I was very lucky to find some out there. What you can do with it, if you're noticing that you're peeling the bark and when you're trying to bend it to make a bowl, it's starting to crack a little bit, you can heat it very slowly on top of a fire. Not so that it's burning, but you'll notice that once it's heated, there's a little more flexibility in it. And you can make that milk carton kind of square by pinching the edges with improvised clothespins, which is little green woods that are split down the middle with maybe a little bit of paracord on the tips to give it a little bit of a spring pressure, and that would be a good container to hold water or to hold berries or whatever resource that you want. And lastly, we have Karie Lee, and she brings up a really good topic: hygiene, especially hair hygiene. Karie has longer hair than some of us out there, and she takes a little bit of a tea bath out there, which is awesome. One thing that you can do out there is making a very mild soap. So while I was out in Maasai in East Africa, we wouldn't take showers for 3 months at a time. And when we did take those showers, they were pretty much sponge baths at that time. So keeping that in mind, how do you make improvised soap? So soap is a combination of a base and a fat or an oil. So what happens is when the water hits that combination of a base and a fat, it makes soap suds and it emulsifies, it captures all these little grits and bacteria and allows the water to wash it away. That's why it's so effective to wash your hands, because it's not necessarily killing bacteria and viruses, it's actually removing it from the surface itself. And you can do that with white ash. So not the charcoal that you see in a fire, but the white stuff. You can mix that a little bit with your hair, especially at the bases. It can be a little irritating if you use too much, but just using a little bit can give it a dry type of texture, which is really nice and doesn't feel like a greasy hair. But immediately when you put some water in it, well, you'll notice that after that wash, your scalp feels pretty darn clean. And that's that reaction with the grime and the oiliness of your hair and scalp mixed in with the lye, the base of that white ash, and then the water kind of just washes that away. So that's kind of like your improvised soap. To make a stronger version of soap, you can use extra fat out there for soap, but again, you're going to be using fat for something for hygiene. So super important to keep as clean as possible. What we have out there is basically things to remove particles. So we have the water, the stream that can remove stuff, and sand and some clay to kind of scrub our hands, and maybe using little bristles to get the bacteria and grit out of our nails. But that's it out there. We don't have any antiseptics, we don't have soap. So really being mindful of where your hands go and making utensils out there to make sure you're not using your fingers to eat as much as possible. Then we also see Karie's permanent shelter location. It looks like it's on a ridgeline. On episode 1, we talk about locations. So if you haven't seen that episode, check it out over here and tell me what you think about camping on ridgelines or barren areas. And it's hard to tell because we don't know what resources are in the area to make that favorable location, but we see her dig in a significant amount, and that's awesome, because I think one of my favorite shelters besides Rock House by Roland is last season's, where it was dug in at the beach, and it was just such a solid structure that was underground. And we also see her make kind of a raised structure on the top for the roofing. One thing that I'm curious to see what happens is how the tarp reacts to that structure, because basically going down the structure, we have a ridge pole and then sticks kind of like this with a tarp on top of that. I imagine with the high winds we have there, and that high winds at that specific location, because there's not a lot of trees kind of on that site, is that going to rattle a lot? Is that going to puncture the tarp and not make it waterproof? But we don't know what happens yet in what she plans for the tarp. Is she going to pile things on, which would be really cool, or is she going to leave it like that? All right, that's it for today. A lot of insights into seeing how people are building their shelter and their strategies behind it. It'll be very interesting to see what that skeleton gets filled out in its final kind of form for the shelter, because that's one of my favorite parts of the show. And as always, if you find value in these types of videos, please consider subscribing and clicking the notification button. Let me know what you want to see more of. I am getting in the groove of posting on YouTube, so we're going to do these recaps and also additional additional content on the medicine side of survival. Specifically coming up, we have hypothermia, we have gut illnesses, we have constipation, we have a lot of good stuff that we see our contestants from season 9 go through, and I'm very excited to talk about that. And if you want more information, especially on my starvation chapter in my upcoming book, it's all up for pre-order at www.learnsurvivalmedicine.com. If you want to reach out to me personally, ask me questions, you're always welcome to do that. All my social media handles I'll put in this description, in addition to everything that I use personally out there as well. So I will see you next time. This is Dr. Tan signing out.